and welcome to Zonan Canada. I'm your host, Jesse Betteridge. So in this episode, we are going to talk about the manga market in Canada. Joining me is a very special guest, a rare Canadian who actually the North American anime manga industry, specifically for the manga publisher 7 Seas Entertainment. It's Lissa Pattillo.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
No problem. Really happy to talk with you today. And yeah, like you're definitely one of the few Canadians who are in the industry. Do you really know anyone else?
Actually, a lot more than you think.
Yeah?
Since a lot of the manga industry, and actually not just manga, comics and arts in general in North America works off freelance, you actually have people working from around the world. And there's actually a number of Canadians, at least I know that we hire, for all sorts of jobs that live here. In fact, it's a strange coincidence just how many people worked for 7 Seas on occasion that live here in the same city as me, over in Halifax, Nova Scotia, before I started working for them.
Oh, wow.
So, I'd say more than you think.
Yeah,
on the down low, because it's freelance. People don't really, you can be anywhere.
That makes sense. And it's interesting how much opportunity there is in that. I mean, we talk about how much of the bust the manga industry went through back in the mid 2000s when, the so-called bubble burst and Tokyo Pop went down in flames. But, I guess 7 Seas at least is one of those companies that seems to have really risen from the ashes and benefited.
Yeah, and numbers-wise, I know 7 Seas actually weathered it pretty well. We'll get into it more detail, but the bubble burst, but I think some publishers actually came out stronger for it. Leveled things out. That's
definitely the flow that we see with these kind of things a lot, especially with an industry like manga. So, again, before you got involved with the actual industry with a professional capacity, you read a blog back in the mid 2000s up to the early 2010s as well, called Kuriousity. It's one of the few Canadian blogs that was had a lot of notoriety and focused a lot on manga. Can you tell us a bit about that and how that kind of came together and played out over the years?
Yeah, Kuriousity was a site that I started technically back in 2004. But at the time, it was just a place that I would put, random fan art, and it was just a miscellaneous website with my own personal fan art, fan fiction, links to things I thought were interesting. But around that time, I was really getting into manga. I'd been reading it in comics for a long while, but with the internet becoming more of a thing, I was starting to really follow it as an industry, because even back then, scanlations weren't the thing they are today. A lot of people were reading manga for the first time in print, buying it legally here. So that was the channels I was following. And so I started following a lot more blogs and websites about it. And that's what Kuriousity started forming into. And then in about 2007, that's what Kuriousity became full-time. I posted manga reviews, news about what was licensed, any interesting tidbits. And also anything specifically anime and manga related for Canadians, because there just wasn't that much out there that focused on the similar, but at the same time pretty different anime and manga world for Canadians.
What defined that distinction for you?
A lot of it was availability. You get a lot of books, manga specifically, released at the same time, but the price in Canada was generally a lot higher, especially back then.
Yeah.
When I first started buying manga, I was paying $34 a book for a flipped Fushigi Yugi volume. And usually they come out a week or so later than the States. And you didn't have places like WriteStuff.com back then that you could order from. Even Amazon wasn't as big. You had big bookstores like Chapters. I think it's called Indigo, the rest of Canada.
It's Chapters here, Indigo in other parts, but depends what region you're in.
Yeah, so Chapters/Indigo. Didn't have as big a manga section as you would hear people talking about going to a Borders or a Barnes & Noble.
Yeah, I think they,
in the States.
From my experience at least over here, they seem to lag behind the US in terms of jumping on the big Tokyo Pop boom in the early 2000s by, I think, a good 2 years.
Yeah, and I think a part of that was because also in Canada, we've always had anime sprinkled on TV. We've had some times better than others, but we never had what the U.S. had with Toonami and their really huge hits. We had big ones, Pokemon, Sailor Moon, Dragon Ball Z, those all hit big. Mm-hmm. But they weren't really the mainstream audience didn't really see those as anime, as manga, as Japanese properties. Unlike the States where they had things like Cowboy Bebop and, all the things that played on their Toonami block for years that we just never got here. And I think that's why, aside from population, the U.S. kind of took to manga and anime availability faster than Canada did.
Yeah, it definitely, I think it came off as more of a risk for bookstores at that point. And, it was the pivotal moment was when that market transitioned into bookstores, with Tokyopop's real authentic manga line, back around 2000, 2001. I remember I first caught wind that Chapters was starting to get stuff in, and I rushed down there on my bike as fast as I could. I think all they had was like a single volume of Chobits and a single volume of GTO, and I snatched both of them up. And I just saw it kind of growing and growing from there. But it was always still kind of scattershot for the longest time.
Yeah, I bought most of my manga for years, well, I still do, from local comic book shops here in Halifax.
Yeah.
Thankfully, they were always pretty quick to get that in, because that was what the younger audience was reading. Excluding, you always have some that are like, I don't want any of that Japanese stuff in here, but for the most part,
many comic book stores are like that. And oftentimes I find it's not because of a lack of demand, it's just people who run the comic book personally have no interest in manga.
I think it's that, and I also think a lot of comic book stores, again, I can't emphasize enough how lucky I am to have, Strange Adventures here in Halifax. Has always been ridiculously, phenomenally supportive of anyone who wants to read comics. But I find, especially when I travel, and I go looking in comic shops for, out-of-print manga and things to fill in holes in my collection, it seems to me they're less disinterested in the content and more disinterested in wanting to associate and serve the people who are into it. Mm-hmm. Which is a lot of, teenage girls, which comic shops are not well known for accommodating, or younger men who don't want to sit down and play Magic the Gathering or read the newest Batman. They want the new Naruto, and a lot of comic book not just comic shop owners, that's, not fair to say just them, but a lot of people look down on different audiences.
And it's so weird because, so much of that kind of gatekeeping audience is so fixated on American comics, and kind of puts that on a pedestal compared to everything else. When you look at the vast size of the manga industry in Japan, or even the comic industry in France and Belgium, it's like, what's the American comic industry is like pathetically small.
Oh yeah, it's a very small industry compared to many other countries in the world. People think that because of movies and stuff now, the comics are mainstream here, but they're really not. If you look at the population in North America, Canada, and the U.S., compared to the people actually reading comics of any kind on a regular basis, it's not mainstream. But when that's all you're kind of engrossed in is just DC and Marvel and the occasional Image comic, that's your whole comic world. So it probably feels very large.
Yeah, and before the transition to bookstores, those price differences were absolutely brutal back then too. Before things started picking up in the chapters in Indigo.
Oh yeah, pick up any old original, especially the Viz books.
Yeah.
Larger trim size, they were flipped. Not dissing them at the time, it was phenomenal you even got them. But you look at the prices pre-printed on the back, and it's, $8 or $9 difference just for buying in Canada.
Direct market has a few quirks with stuff like that.
Yeah, and I was buying manga before I was old enough to get a job, so that was quite a bit of allowance to save up for one book. So you treasured a bookshelf that had more than a few volumes of manga on it.
Oh man, those were the... No, not really.
Those were also the days where you could buy manga in the single issues. That was also interesting, chapter for chapter, just like American comics. I bought a lot of those.
Yeah, it's so weird looking back on it how how so many publishers tried to twist manga around to work in that format. And how many people stood by it for so long. I find the whole idea of paying, I guess now almost $5 or $6 for what is essentially a 30-page pamphlet.
Yeah, I know. It's when you look at the value I find that you get for manga, it's pretty hard to compare. I still buy a lot of comics, but I get an issue and I'm done in 5 minutes. And I've paid, if I pay double that price, I'm going to get an hour's worth out of a volume of manga maybe. So, quite a difference.
Just going back to that difference in market scale, manga is, there's always been an interesting challenge to try and cut that down into something that is approachable for a Western audience, just because when you go to Japan, it's completely ubiquitous. when you were running Kuriousity, like, how did you, like, obviously it's, even at that point when the manga industry was kind of, was burgeoning, it was still such a big thing to try and keep track of, like, running a single website about all the manga coming out, seems kind of befuddling. How did you approach it? What did you focus on? What did you find was the most important thing to fixate on when, trying to follow this whole industry?
Well, the biggest thing I started with was reviews, and that stayed consistent
Mm-hmm.
throughout the first half of Curiosity's life, going a little more to news. But it was because I was reading a lot of reviews at the time because there was so much coming out. And when buying books in the store was your first exposure to most of this content, reviews were the best way for me to see if I was interested in something aside from a cover. So yeah, I, put a review or two up every day, for years of just, books that I had read that I'd bought myself and what I thought about them. And yeah, so for me at the time, that was the biggest thing. I was basically trying to mimic the sites that I went to on a regular basis. And then after that, it was mostly just writing news about what books were being licensed. And at the time, social media wasn't the beast it is today. So you didn't kind of get fed that information from Twitter and Facebook and Tumblr every second. So if you didn't go to publishers' websites, it might be unlikely you'd know what was coming. So I would post news like that. And for a while, I had the habit of trolling, as I was called, Amazon websites. You'd often see what was licensed before it was announced.
Ah, yes.
So now working in the industry, I can tell people I don't blame you for doing it, but it does cause some problems.
Good to know. Good to know.
But yeah, so that was kind of my focus. It was literally just I was writing for me. Pretty much. I was like, what do I want? Well, I want to know what I can buy, and I want to know what's worth buying right now.
Yeah, the site certainly had a personal touch to it. Personally, I've found the manga industry very difficult to follow. Like, so much stuff gets released now. And usually I find out that something is licensed long after it's actually come out. It kind of blindsides me sometimes. Like, wow, that actually got licensed and released? That's crazy.
At least the nice part about that is you can go out and get it right away.
Yeah, exactly.
One of the more frustrating parts of working in the North American manga industry, or I should say North American publishing industry in general, is because of the vast amount of content coming out, you're required to schedule things very far in advance, and release that information publicly very far in advance, which can be very frustrating when you're translating something as opposed to writing it from scratch. Because at the time you're announcing something, you probably have it ready to go. The book's been out in Japan for years, but you still have to wait. You can't publish it right away. So a lot of people who follow manga news, and it was the same when I was publishing about it years ago, you would hear, oh, we've licensed such and such a title. You can get it in 13 months from now. And that upsets a lot of people, but it's one of the shackles of publishing in North America. Publishers don't have a choice. They would love to have everyone find out about something being licensed and then able to buy it that day. Like that's at least one benefit of kind of not staying connected to manga news 24/7 is you can hear about things once they're already out. Mm-hmm. No waiting.
How do you find that the industry here in North America compares to, say, like in France or Germany? I noticed that it almost seems that stuff often comes out faster there, or rather they seem to get a lot of stuff that doesn't get released immediately here. Obviously there's a very different history going on there, but how do you find the market here in Canada compares to, say, one of those markets?
Well, I'm not too well versed in those markets, but as a Canadian, I can say that I grew up getting a lot of manga in French as well.
Oh yeah.
They had a lot of manga published far before we did. And I could read French, so that was a really nice bonus that I could get.
Like back in the early 2000s, that always helped if you a lot more out there.
Yeah, and I still buy French volumes today. My reading comprehension's not as good as it probably should be, but they still get a lot of series that we would probably never get here, and the production values on their books are incredible. And that's part of for the same reason that there's so much manga in Japan in the first place. It's when you have a bigger audience of readers, you can afford to take more risks. You can afford to make books fancier, because you're going to make your money back, or you you can have a certain amount of faith that the audience is there. So at least I can only really, compare here to France, but whereas their comic industry is a lot more diverse in general, they're not kind of pigeonholed by the whole comics or superheroes thing like we are in North America. They have a lot more readers that are open to all the different genres that Japan's comics can offer.
And
you get a lot more diversity in what they publish that way.
Yeah, I've always noticed that the French comics, they generally actually have slipcovers around them, because generally when you read manga in Japan, they have a slipcover around the main cover, and it's a little smaller in size. The French volumes seem to mirror that a little more closely, and are often, if not the same price, a little lower in price. Whereas doing slipcovers for English manga releases has always been considered cost prohibitive. So it's really interesting how those different markets evolved.
Yeah, I mean, cover slips are expensive, but also keep in mind too the different size of countries, physical size, and not just population. Shipping and storing books or any material is very, very expensive, and distributing books around a country as big as the U.S. or Canada, you're paying a lot more just for something like that, and that does take a cut.
Do you find there's any difference between those markets in how comic artists versus mangaka are kind of treated or interpreted in, as celebrity or in terms of notoriety?
You mean between in Japan versus North America?
Or North America, or in Europe for that matter, or France, I guess, just to make it easier.
I feel like names are a bit more well known over in markets like France. Again, I think that stems from the fact that they're just more accustomed to comics sort of as an art form, whereas I feel like comics in general here are a little more disposable, or these days people see them as just the stepping stone to the next movie franchise. And, there's always been stages of years where people have seen that with manga too, where is it going to be the next big thing, the next Pokemon, or now we've got, Ghost in the Shell coming in theaters. But in terms of the creators, I think they are seen very differently. A big part of that is just the way that the industry treats them. In Japan, you can get very well known as a manga artist by name. But, like anyone, you have to have some pretty big titles under your belt for people to be a household name, like a Clamp or an Akira Toriyama. But a lot of them are just so overworked. The publication schedule of manga in Japan is insane compared to here. And most manga artists tend to be the author and the artist, whereas here you'd have an author, an artist, and the artist might be the penciler, the inker, the colorist. And you have someone else who, puts it all in book format and lays it out and letters it. In Japan, a lot of that falls onto one person's lap. And sometimes if they're big enough, they can afford to have assistants. And I think part of what that does is they don't have time to kind of market themselves as a person. It's just the work. And I find, at least, here in the comic industry, there are a lot of people who will buy books based on who did it, who the author is, who the artist is. But with exception of a few really big name people, even in North America, manga doesn't sell that way. You can get the next series by the creator of Naruto, and you're not even guaranteed it's going to do very well based on that. Mm-hmm. Which I'm sure people in comics industry might find that weird because, I don't know, I just find that the manga artists just aren't seen the same way.
There's also the whole issue of how the copyright works in Japan, with the original creator having a very large amount of control compared to what you find in other countries too, I think.
It makes a difference, but again, only for those big enough to be a name like that. Most, I think, just, it's their work and that's it. And also, just the culture of Japan is different. North America, the U.S. in particular, is a bit more boisterous. You want to put your name out there. You want to have, the 50,000 Twitter followers or get invited to a con. In Japan, you're a lot more, I guess you could say, humble. You keep to yourself. Some of them are like, I just want to make my work, have people love it, and leave me alone. Either because they don't have time or they're, not comfortable with that. And I just think, there's a huge just cultural difference, and that reflects in the way that people react to them as well.
So, what do you find have been the biggest ways that the manga market has grown in Canada over the years? I mean, we talked about the correction in the mid 2000s with the basically the destruction of Tokyo Pop, but they're not really gone. Would you say that there's been it has grown overall, regardless of that correction?
I would say it has grown overall, yes. I think a big part is because, again, you have, there was a slow period for a while there, but now you can go into any chapters or Indigo, and you've got the aisle of manga again. You've got more books than you could, feasibly buy in one go. And also, I think the internet is the biggest thing. Even, putting aside scanlations, because that's the illegal way to read your stuff, but legally, manga in Canada, the internet's made a huge difference because you can buy things from Amazon, from Chapters, or even from WriteStuff.com, from any company, and get it sent to your house. You don't need to find the rare comic shop. You don't need to kind of be trapped at the whims of whatever Chapters wants to stock, which is not always everything. And also, the growing anime streaming is huge. How much you can watch legally right away the same day it comes out. And for the most part, but not all the time, Canada gets what the U.S. does. So that just is a general, huge promotion, building awareness of the properties, which in turn helps the manga.
Interesting you bring up simulcasts, because one criticism or one thought I have on the manga industry here is that, or whenever you hear the debate about piracy and how people should buy titles to support the industry here, I think one thing that kind of gets overlooked a lot is the fact that the market here is sort of missing that serialization aspect that you get in Japan, where you buy the manga compilation books and it serializes a whole bunch of titles for an extremely low price. And a lot of people will casually follow titles in there and then buy the books after when they've already read the material and know that they like it. Do you think that, and when you look at like anime piracy, one of the biggest issues was the fact that people were downloading content, not always because they didn't want to pay for it, or because they wanted it for free, but because they wanted to keep up with the content as it was coming out in Japan. And I've personally found that the anime industry has adapted to that demand a little better than the manga industry has. You do have, of course, Crunchyroll, who is trying out simulpubs with a number of with a number of titles, although it's arguably a very small number of titles compared to the vast amount of manga being released in Japan. But then you have that vast, almost ubiquity of manga you have in Japan. Obviously makes it a lot more difficult to use that kind of approach here. I don't know. What are your thoughts on digital distribution in that regard? Like how palatable is it to cover that serialization gap through digital?
Well, I think first and foremost, there's way too much manga to ever have any sort of system like they do in Japan, and also we have nowhere near the audience to support it. Here, a best-selling manga title in print could print a couple thousand copies. In Japan, a single volume would sell millions. And it's the same when you have the circulation of something like Shonen Jump and all the different Shonen Sundays and, dozens and dozens of manga magazines that come out in Japan. And they can because they can print them very cheap. They don't have to ship them very far because Japan is not very physically large. And you have a huge audience to support them. And the more people that buy something, the cheaper a book becomes. And it's the same with North America. You find that the more people are buying something, the cheaper the books become. And we're in a pretty good state for that right now. Digitally, people just aren't as interested in reading books digitally as they are in print. You see that in all mediums, fiction, nonfiction. Digital's growing, but it's still can't come close to print. And that's just, I think the tactile difference. People who like to read generally prefer to have a physical copy. And then there's a collecting aspect. Whereas anime, like TV and movies, is something that people see as a bit more disposable, and the experience isn't different. I mean, you can go to the store and buy a Blu-ray and pop it in your DVD player, but chances are it's going to look the same as watching it on Netflix in high def. So it's the different medium, works in a different way. And also with manga, it's expensive to simulpub because you have to not only pay for the material, get the material, but you have to pay a translator, you have to pay a cleanup artist, you have to letter it, you have to lay it out. I'm not saying that subtitling anime is easier, but there are a few less steps involved to get it out. And there isn't, and although we have so much anime now, I can't keep up every season, not even close. it's still shadows, and like there's nothing in comparison to how many manga you'd have to publish to even be putting out a fraction of what Japan gets every week. So some publishers are trying. You've got several simulpubs coming out. The Viz Media Shonen Jump still blows my mind what a good value that is, like how they can even put that out for so cheap. Like what do we pay, like $26 as Canadians a year for a new issue of Shonen Jump every week? Like it's
pretty crazy, yeah.
Yeah, I still don't know how they do that. But they took a chance and tackled it the way that you do in Japan, where you get a lot of content for cheap, and you use that to attract a very large market that makes up for the cheapness. And I don't think currently, in summary of my long rant, that there is enough of an audience to support that for a lot of other manga.
I have found, or at least from my perspective with digital a lot of the time, the approach seems to be still treating it as an alternative to like the printed, completed final volume rather than something to release in chapters, even if it's not simultaneously with Japan. Still release it before the release of the final collected volume. I think a lot of the publishers are starting to shift in either both or a different direction, but that still seems to be an issue I see coming up a lot with the way digital is being treated.
Yeah, and one of the big issues there, I know every publisher has the same concern. Well, one, there are a lot of licensors or publishers, or I should say artists in Japan who don't want their stuff digitally. And even Japan, is only recently embracing digital manga over there. I mean, it's exploded, but they held off for a very long time because it just wasn't what people wanted. It wasn't traditional. And there are a lot of artists who still don't want their stuff digitally. So even if a manga publisher wanted to, maybe they got told no. Maybe they got told not right now. And the other issue is you're constantly combating, there are way more people who read manga and probably not watch anime so much, but read manga legally than people who support it legally. And there's always the concern about splitting the ones who do have it legally. If you give them it digitally, are they not going to buy it in print? And print books are more important in the grand scheme of things, whereas I said, the more it gets bought, the cheaper you can make them. So if you have less people buying a print book, the print books are going to get more expensive. Whereas that doesn't change for digital, and that comes down to printing costs. So that is the biggest issue here in North America for digital manga, is you don't want to have the digital sales cut into print, because the quantity of buyers for print is a huge dictator of how cheaply you can sell people the books. And nobody wants manga to get really expensive again, because there's not enough buyers for it. And I can't speak for all cases, but in many cases, the manga is sold and artists get a royalty. It goes back to what you said about how, artists get, they have more hold on their copyright, but they get a smaller cut from digital sales. And I can only speak generally from, working in the industry and talking with other publishers, but that's generally the case because the biggest ebook platforms, Kindle, for example, take a very large cut up front just to sell their books on the platform. So in turn, creators and publishers both get less from it. So there are a lot of reasons why print is still preferred over digital. So, and everyone's trying different things. Every company is exploring new avenues, what works best. How can we get people what they want as fast as they want it, while still keeping costs low so we're not, needing to charge the customer more, and also ensuring that everybody who works on these books gets credited and paid for it.
So in regards to, the issue you brought up a little earlier about the market having to, how serving such a large market across or serving such a relatively small market across a large geographical space obviously influence the industry. I'm sure many would make the argument that Canada is kind of a drag on the publishing industry as a whole, since we are attached to the American market, overall. Realistically speaking, do you think the market would function more effectively if it didn't have to cater to Canada?
I don't think it really makes that big a difference. Manga publishers specifically generally all work with distributors that help distribute, millions of other books of all types of content. And there are systems in place for putting books out across Canada. I don't think manga is, I don't think Canada negatively affects manga. But I do think that, Canadian market is less valuable, simply just because our population is so much less. I mean, the entire population of Canada, I think, is smaller than just California, and we have bigger space. So, not as much pull here, simply because we don't have even the ability to have as big an audience. That's also the reason why you're not going to see as many anime shows in theaters here, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's been an issue lately. Yeah, so it seems that, like, no matter how sort of concentrated the market gets, it can only be so valuable in the end. Looking at just Canada, how everything's expanded. The manga's interesting because, like I sort of alluded to earlier, if you look at Japan or even France to a degree, it's so ubiquitous that you can't even really put a box around it. It's just kind of everywhere. Would you say that here in Canada do you think it's sort of broken through that threshold of ubiquity? Do you think it's become, as mainstream as it's going to get, or fairly mainstream, or do you think it still kind of has that box around it? Do you think it still has room to grow and become more, or just kind of expand to greater avenues?
I think it absolutely has room to grow. I think, again, where more people will know an anime and manga is based on the properties that get big. And we haven't really had a huge animated, like an anime that's gotten really big in Canada. And sometimes it's really hard to make the line between, well, it's huge in the US, it must be huge in Canada. I mean, look at something like Attack on Titan. We didn't get that on TV here.
Yeah.
But we probably won't. We don't really have a channel that accommodates that kind of content unless you get satellite, and then you're just getting an American channel. But we do have Netflix, so stuff like that can do really well on Netflix. But what does well on streaming that, you can watch it on Funimation or Crunchyroll or Netflix it's not the same as being on cable. It's not the same as having a Sailor Moon or a Pokemon, where you could still probably ask anyone outside now if they'd heard of Pokemon, and they probably have. But they also probably couldn't tell you that it's, a Japanese game that has over 900 animated episodes and all these manga series, and all these other series are connected to it because they're also from Japan. You don't have anime on TV that every parent with a child is going to know about. So I think in Canada, especially, it's definitely not mainstream broken anymore. It's very much in a box.
I wrote a letter to CBC telling them they really need to air Attack on Titan late at night. I'm probably crazy, and that probably won't happen, but I think it was worth a shot at least. So you'd say that being on TV is still more significant in regards to mainstream visibility than online streaming is, despite how much streaming has taken off.
Absolutely, because even streaming, look at Crunchyroll. I'm going to use them as an example because they're the top, legal anime streamer. Even then, the only people that are going to use it are people looking for anime. That's very, very different than someone who's going to sit on their couch, watch Game of Thrones, and then right after Game of Thrones, the new episode of Attack on Titan comes on. That is a completely different audience you'd be reaching. And they have that more in the States because they have had the recent resurgence of Toonami and Adult Swim that are playing more anime for an older audience on television again. And then, you have Disney. They bought Yokai Watch because they were kind of trying to get their own Pokemon. So, the effort is there. But think of how amazing it would be if, YTV, in a bout of nostalgia, started airing the new dub of Sailor Moon, like they used to way back in the day with the Deep dub. Or if, even in the States they can't get Dragon Ball Super on TV, how amazing would that be to have here on YTV again? Even if you're just kind of feeding off the nostalgia of people our age who grew up with it on TV here, you'd still be exposing it to a huge new market as well.
One of the big questions is because Dragon Ball Super is being pitched to TV in the States, apparently a number of stations are bidding on it. I guess the big question is it going to be like a sort of a more of a localized kid show when it does hit? I know Teletoon is running Yokai Watch, so it's possible that Dragon Ball Super is treated as more of a kid's property. It might have a decent shot of actually showing up here. That's a big maybe, though.
I don't think it would be treated necessarily as a kid's property the same way it was before. It
Yeah.
might get some censoring, and that's purely just to get it airing at an earlier time.
Yeah.
But these days, it's just like watching any dub of something. You know, there's a big enough market of just anime and manga fans that if you cater to them and give them a good, authentic experience, they can generally support you. Whereas years ago, you had to get a title out there to as many people as possible if you wanted a hit. You know, there wasn't a Netflix of the day. You want to get on cable, you had to play by cable's rules. And that still exists now. If they want to get, you know, a title like Dragon Ball Z on mainstream television, well, absolutely, you want to do that. But there are still a few, you know, rules you have to abide by. But even so, it's like companies will only do what they absolutely have to. They're not going to change a single thing from the original unless they have to do it. You'd be alienating too many new fans that way.
One thing that you talked about on your site back when it was active was issues involving importing manga into Canada. And I know there's always been sort of this misconception that Canada has these like horrible, excessively draconian pornography laws that make it hell for bringing in not just anime porn, but just any anime or manga that is, you know, erotic or not, which is not really true. The actual laws we have here, I think, are quite clear-cut and reasonable, but there tends to be issues with customs that have arisen a lot over the years. Did you have any experiences with that, or anything that you followed about that specifically?
Well, I mean, I follow, you always hear, like, the stories. There's great organizations like the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund who help raise money to support people who kind of fall victim to these, you know, random searches gone horribly wrong. And, you know, it's like you said, the Canadian, you know, pornography laws are not stricter necessarily than the States or anywhere else. In fact, fun fact, a lot of people can pick up most of the hentai and boys love and 18-plus material and manga that they've bought over the last 20 years. They will say printed in Canada, because a lot of American printers will not print that material.
Yeah.
And then you get this ironic situation where it's printed in Canada, shipped to the States, then you buy it in the States, and you're terrified to bring it back over the border to Canada.
A lot of it actually shows up in store shelves here, especially with the BL titles, but then it always somehow, it very frequently runs into problems with border guards in customs.
And I mean, and a big part of that is also, you know, what specific border guard you get on that day.
Exactly.
When you look at how many big cases there have been versus how many people cross the border every single second, it's a very, very small number. But yeah, like as you know, lenient as a law could be for something like art, being considered pornographic, whether it is or not, you know, you're still going to have, if you get the wrong person who, you know, is just really against something because it's gay. Like, there's no sex in it. But the moment they're like, oh, this is like Japanese and it's about two guys or two girls, like it's porn, it's not appropriate. You're like, that's not the law. That's just you. But it is something you have to watch out for because, like, you've seen, you know, and I do recommend people, there's some really good, breakdowns of these legal trials that people have gone through, because they got caught with, you know, hentai and stuff that people even consider child porn. It really comes down to what is the understanding of the people who are looking at this stuff. A lot of people look at anime manga characters and they think they're not underage, but they might be drawn in a way that people here who, you know, aren't used to that art style, they don't recognize it, you know, the nuances, as you'd say, could only see it as underage characters.
Because as recently as 2013, I know the CBSA, they restricted a title called Bonds of Dreams, Bonds of Love from coming across the border, which, as far as I can tell, is not really, you know, any worse than a standard BL title. And you can, and again, it's on store shelves at Chapters or Indigo. You can actually buy it, but it's been prohibited from being imported in Canada, and Right Stuff will not send it out now. And that's just, it's so strange because, like, the only way that would have happened is if a particular border guard personally felt that, one, that comics are for children, and two, that homosexuality is immoral or should not be depicted in media. And it's just so screwed up that there's like so little oversight at the CBSA that that it basically comes down to the moral judgment of a single border guard, as to what is allowed in and out, or what is and is not allowed in the country. I really hope that something is addressed about that in the future at some point, but it's been going on for so long. And you mentioned, this does frequently happen to game material a lot of the time, and this goes back to like the late 80s and early 90s with the whole, here in Vancouver we have a place called Little Sisters Bookshop and Emporium, and they fought for years because they kept getting their shipments. But it almost seems like, that kind of bias is now being directed to a lot of manga titles.
Yeah, and a big problem with that, and it's a very wide issue that is in no way specific to manga or comics, is that a lot of people think that if you're gay or content is about being gay or same-sex relationships, it has to be sexual. And that is an attitude that is slowly changing. But, a story about two girls dating in high school is not necessarily any more sexual than a romance story about a guy and a girl dating in high school. But one will automatically be seen as sexual. And so you get that issue with a lot of boys' love, even if it's just fluffy, teen rated. They're like, oh, no, if they're gay, there must be a sexual component to this. So ban it. One of my first trips to the States, the first time I went there was actually to San Diego Comic-Con, quite a few years ago now. God knows it'd be impossible to get a ticket these days.
Yeah.
But I was down there, and that was at a point in my life where I was buying pretty much every volume of manga that came out. We're talking like dozens, if not 100 a month. Like, if it was out, that was where my money was going outside of rent. And so I went down to San Diego, stars in my eyes, 2 empty suitcases, I was ready to go. And I bought also down there several hentai titles because you just couldn't get them up here. From a company at the time called it was Icarus.
Yeah.
And they had one title by one of my favorite artists at the time. It was an anthology, and it had one story in it where it was a teacher having sex with a student. Older female teacher sex with a young male student. And even I was like, okay, art style wise, he looks pretty young. They like to remind you 10 times over he's in high school, but to an outside eye. And I was terrified. I didn't feel any shame in having it. I didn't care who knew. I still don't. I got a wall of hentai in my boys' love, in my library. Big whoop. But the idea of someone seeing that when I crossed the border, and then suddenly thinking, that I was some sort of like pervert trying to bring in this illegal Japanese porn from America. Like, I had it wrapped in so many bags and buried underneath the most all ages appropriate books I could think of, underneath the new Legend of Zelda and Pokemon Adventures. Because, yeah, even though, I also being, a young woman at the time would face probably less scrutiny than a male my age carrying porn across the border would have been. That was still a really scary thought, and I still would have that concern crossing the border. What photos are on my phone? What adorable, fan art did I save that somebody, the wrong person, might see and be like, uh-oh, like this person is bringing smut. And I'm not afraid of the system as a whole. It's always, are you going to be the unlucky person who's going to get the wrong crossing guard, the wrong border patrol?
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah, and Right Stuff, that surprised me when that was a couple of years ago now, I think.
Yeah.
It got very difficult to order from them because there was like a $150 threshold, and then it was a $250 threshold, and then you had to pay for shipping, and then their shipping was free, but, I've gotten dinged almost $150 when it shows up at the door from customs fees. And now, honestly, I don't order from Right Stuff anymore at all because I used to order, hentai and boys love from them because you couldn't find it here. And they don't ship that across the border anymore. Too many close calls. I assume someone came after them for shipping that material.
Yeah, the thing about Right Stuff, they had that survey they released recently for Canadian customers, and I've always had a similar attitude about Right Stuff because I've been just dinged with customs charges for things I brought in before. They have apparently addressed that problem. They prepay for all the customs stuff now, and I got a shipment from them recently, and it came very quickly, and I got no dings. So I guess they've improved in that area, but then you still have all those other inherent problems that come from having to, from the consumer end, import things from across the border and the shipping costs as well. I think they might be doing something about the shipping costs as well, maybe something tiered. But I made sure to tell them in my comments that they really need to consider having a WriteStuffAnime.ca with a warehouse on this side of the border, which would be expensive to run initially, but I think it's the only real solution, and I think it would be a sustainable one in the long run at least.
Yeah, like you said, it would be very expensive because we just don't have the population.
Yeah.
Every single person in Canada could be buying manga from WriteStuff.ca, and it still would pale in comparison to the potential of the States, just we don't have enough people. But yeah, it's probably not worthwhile to them when Canada's already pretty well serviced by Amazon.ca and Chapters.ca. But yeah, it's a big issue. The cost of shipping is huge. I don't know if you ever tried shipping something to the States from here. Our postal system is not cheap. And, not even to bring into the issue of the Canadian dollar, which is currently fantastic if you're getting paid in American.
I'm sure it is.
But if you're trying to buy anything, even within our country, the cost of everything is going up because it's so expensive to buy from the States. So that's a big issue for them as well. A lot of people from Canada won't buy from Right Stuff because, oh look, it's only $2.99 until you put it in your cart, and now suddenly it's $5.14 or something, depending on what the dollar is that day. So
yeah, something drastic has to happen, but like how you approach it, it's hard to say. Okay, so to finish off, any manga titles that we should be looking at that you've been into lately or would recommend?
Well, it's a bit self-serving that I can point out that some that I have worked on for 7 Seas.
Either way.
But I do think I would highly recommend people keep an eye on what any publisher is putting out, because I think right now you are starting to see a really big diversity shift that we haven't in a while, maybe since the boom in the early 2000s, which even then you were kind of seeing a lot of the same thing. I think you can find a lot more unique gems right now. And they absolutely need support because different publishers are taking risks on different things, but if it doesn't sell well, they can't publish more like it. So yeah, I guess I'll give one pimp or something we just put out, called Please Tell Me Galko-chan.
Yes, that's,
which, there was an anime that came out for it, short episodes.
There sure was.
And I think it's absolutely fantastic. We put it out in full color, nice and big trim, just came out last week. And I keep joking, half joking, I wish I had this, in school, in sex ed class. Cause it's just a story about, high school students talking about, there's my puppy being angry, talking very frankly about questions that teenagers actually talk about that are considered taboo or too embarrassing. Breast sizes, buying bras, or, guys' sexual performance. And it's all very innocent. It's just as if you were sitting in a circle with your friends in school and being like, hey guys, what do you think about this? And I think it's just fantastic. I think that it's great in that way.
It's an interesting title because I think it was like a seinen title targeted at adult men in Japan, and it seemed the intention was to sort of, or commercially, it seems to be directed towards, men who want to see girls talk about stuff like that. But the actual material comes all the way back around and seems like it would be much more appealing for, again, girls who are actually in high school or fall into that, that age bracket and would relate to that kind of discussion and stuff. Oh,
absolutely. I think it's, you read it and I'm like, man, I would have been way too embarrassed to ask this when I was in high school, but I really wanted to know. But I, wouldn't ask my mom this or my friends this. So it's kind of really fun and refreshing to read it in a manga. At the same time, I also read it and I'm like, man, if this is targeted at young men, I hope they're reading it because they could learn a lot. They are definitely not taught about women or themselves in school. So, yeah, I look at it as it's entertaining. It's gorgeous to look at because it's in full color. But it's also, I would call it sex educational. So.
It's a great series. I recommend it too. And I may pick it up. Well, Lissa, thanks a lot for coming on despite our drastic time zone difference. I'm glad we were able to make this work.
As someone who now works with people, from California to Tokyo, time difference. You make it work, eventually.
Such is the world we live in. All right,
Yep.
Thanks a lot.
No problem. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for listening to Zon and Canada. The theme song is by Ultraclystron, which you can purchase as part of his album Packet Flood at ultraclystron.com. You can reach me through Twitter at ZonandCanada or email zonandcanada@gmail.com. Please subscribe to the show on iTunes or on your podcast app of choice. And as always, please recommend this show to anyone you think might be interested. See you again. Bye.